Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, Follow me.
Good morning. It's a toasty one today. A little hot. Glad everyone made it safely across. All the ladies that were in the classroom across the parking lot didn't get burnt on the way over here. So I'm glad you could make it over here to the AC building here. I think all of us would like to think that we would handle certain stressful situations or maybe tough situations or frightening situations a certain way, with a level head, with a sense of confidence. And I know that me and Carl would always talk about these things growing up, my younger brother, and we would kind of try and outdo each other to see who was the most manly. And then I felt like I needed to compensate a little bit because he kept on growing, and he got 6'4", so I had to keep trying to do things to one up and make sure that he still knew that I was the older brother and that I was on top and I was in charge and I'm the boss. But we would always try and outdo, like, who was the most brave, who was the most confident. We went back and forth for a long time, and then it all kind of came to a head one night when we were out metal detecting, as dorky as that sounds. We were out relic hunting together. It was at night. There was a full moon out, and we're metal detecting all through the woods, and we're on this property we had never been on before, and we were up in these mountains and all over the place, and it started getting really difficult for us to walk because there were just these tight trees everywhere. And we began to sneak through these, trying to keep quiet with our metal detectors, not to wake up any of the neighbors that are on either side. We're not in people's property, by the way, but there are neighboring houses, and so we're trying to keep it down. It's a really eerie night, but then all of a sudden, Carl, the 6'4", big, giant, muscly man with a beard, he throws his arm out in front of my chest and says, "Stop right there." And I was like, "What is it?" And he said, "Look." And he pointed through the woods and he said, "There's some men with flashlights walking through the woods right for us." And so I was like, "Okay, well, maybe let's say hi. Let's yell something out." And he's like, "No, don't do that." He's like, "What if they have a gun? What if they're dangerous?" And I was like, "Well, we don't know that." And I was like, "Fine, let's just sit down here inside these bushes and just wait and see if they just walk by. Instead of confronting them, let's just try not to spook them because Carl already looks like Bigfoot." I was like, "Let's just try and crouch down." I couldn't even finish that sentence before I turned around, and Carl is like long stride running straight through the woods away from me. And I was like, "What?" So he would have left me right there in that situation. If they were dangerous men, now I know what Carl would do. He would run and leave me there to fend for myself. But eventually I caught up to him, and I was like, "Hey," and I was like, "Calm down. Let's try and figure out what's going on here. Let's not get lost out here in these woods." And the whole time he's got the crazy eyes. I mean, like, they are wide, and he's like looking around through the trees. And I'm like, "You are way too big to look like that." It's like that's not how you're supposed to look when you have a beard that big. But I tried to calm him down, and eventually, I kid you not, we stared through those woods, and I'm looking for the flashlights that I did not see. And he goes, "No, I'm telling you, I'm looking at him right now." And I was like, "You can still see him?" And he's like, "Yeah." And so I keep watching, and then finally he slowly stands up and goes, "Oh, never mind. It's the moon." It was the moon shining through the trees that he thought was flashlights from two sinister men chasing two boys metal detecting out in the woods. It's a very unlikely story, but anyway, that's how he would react in those situations. But I would like to say that I was not terrified at all either. My heart was pounding too. But we cook up these scenarios in our heads maybe of, if this were to happen, this is how I would react. If I was ever faced with this situation, this is how I would present myself. And most of the time it's calm, cool, and collected. That's how we would like to picture ourselves in those situations. But if husbands or wives, if you've ever been scared by your spouse before, they just hop out of a closet or a room and you scream like a little girl. It happened to my parents. It's already happened to me in my marriage. If it's a burglar and they jump out, most likely we're not going to be like, "Halt," and then, be like totally a Superman about it. We're going to be afraid and react badly to it or embarrassing to it. When you look at Peter as a disciple throughout the entire New Testament, that is the story of his life. You see a man, as you follow the events in his life, you see a man who wants to do the right thing, who has this desire to do the right thing. And really, I mean, he's sincere about it. It's not that he doesn't want to do it. In fact, if you look in Matthew chapter 4, he's the first disciple that Jesus calls. That Peter and Andrew are out in the boat. And so Jesus already knows the potential that Peter has before this journey has even begun. And I noticed something interesting as I was working through the book of Matthew. I noticed that right after Matthew chapter 4, when Peter is called and Andrew is called and some of the other disciples are called, Jesus begins to preach this long sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, and he covers a lot of ground, a lot more ground than I'm going to cover tonight, a various array of topics all through this one lesson. And Peter is hearing all of these things about anger, about lust, about marriage. He's learning all of these difficult aspects of Christianity, or what can be difficult. He hears all of these things as a brand new follower of Jesus, and he still decides to follow after that. He doesn't think, hey, it was a little strange that this man approached me and said, follow me. And then seemingly, at least the text doesn't indicate that he had this questioning look on his face or anything, but he hops out and he follows Jesus. And then he hears all of these teachings, some of which are contrary to the teachings that Peter had grown up hearing. And he's still following Jesus. But some of my favorite moments, we're just going to highlight the moments of his life leading up to the text that we're going to look at today, which is John 21, if you'd like to go there. But leading up to that moment, as you see Peter growing in some ways and in some ways taking a few steps back, I believe that's why we love Peter so much, is because he's a very realistic person. He pretty much depicts the average Christian today in the church. Sometimes you are growing, sometimes you're going in the right direction, sometimes you make great decisions, and sometimes you take a few steps back. Sometimes you haven't learned things that maybe you should have already known or should have already learned, but we can learn a lot from the life of Peter. Especially what I want to focus on today is the way that Jesus looks at Peter and the way that Jesus thinks of Peter. And all of this, when Peter lets Jesus down time after time, as we see throughout, as he follows Jesus around, no, Jesus does not turn around and say, you're hopeless as a disciple. I don't know why I decided to choose you first, but you're hopeless. And then Jesus doesn't hold it against him and say, let's recap all of these events in your life leading up to this point, and you tell me, Peter, if you are worthy of one of my followers. And then go through all of the mistakes that Peter has made in his life. He doesn't do that. But he encourages Peter to be better, but sometimes he does have to do those disciplinary acts that we'll see, especially once you get into Matthew chapter 16. So following up to this point, you can probably think of other moments. I'm going to miss a few of them in Peter's life where he is now immortalized in God's Word. Now you think about, I think we touched on this a little while ago, but as I started going through the book of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I haven't gone through John yet, but as I was going through those books, looking at the events in Peter's life, I noticed how many times that even the headings in my Bible say, Peter, fill in the blank. Peter's doing something. And you think about how the Bible is going to be around forever. And in fact, even on the day of judgment, we know that there are going to be two books that are opened. One is the book of life, and one is the Bible, that we're going to be held up to measure how we were in this life. So Peter is now in this book forever. And sometimes I wonder if there's if you have a way, I don't know because I've never been there, obviously, in heaven, to look down on earth. And I wonder if there is that ability. I don't know. There is really no way of knowing until we get there. If Peter looks down on Sunday mornings and goes, they're preaching about that again, and one of his mistakes that he made, or when you read about how confident he is when he steps out of the boat, when he sees Jesus, he said, if you're really Jesus, then allow me to come out there on the water. And he steps out, and then he sinks. And I wonder if he kind of has that, those moments that you think back on in your life that you're embarrassed of, and you go, oh, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I said that, or I can't believe that this actually happened. And you kind of want to stifle those memories and forget about it. Well, Peter is in this book forever and not going anywhere. And you have these mistakes in his life, but you do see how Peter makes this incredible comeback. And we do know that. I'm not telling you anything that you probably don't know. He goes on to write 1st and 2nd Peter, which are basically two letters on Christian living. And so you see how far Peter has come, which gives us a whole lot of hope. Even as Peter is witnessing miracles of Jesus, he's hearing the teachings of Jesus, he still makes mistakes, and Jesus doesn't turn around and totally cut him off of his discipleship. In fact, you see the love that Jesus has to Peter. And what I want to do is, as we go through these accounts of Peter, and especially when we get to John chapter 21, I want you to picture your relationship with Jesus and then put yourself in Peter's shoes, because Jesus is right now currently invisible except for through us, the way that we shine lights in this world and the way that we live out these Christian characteristics. But Jesus and God, they're not, he's not this cruel God who wants us to mess up and wants us to fail, and then it's just going to whip out the belt or the paddle every time we make this small minor mistake. When you see Jesus interact with his creation, which is a mind-blowing thought to think of even on its own. Jesus made Peter, and he's having this conversation with Peter. When you see the kind of love that he has for him and the way that he talks conversationally with him, it really does give you this different perspective on who Jesus is. So as we go through his life, we know that Peter is the guy that stepped out of the boat, and he's the one that sank. We also know that Peter had his shining moment in Matthew chapter 16, when before anybody else seemingly, he points at Jesus and says, "You are the Christ," and he figures it out, kind of. He says it, but that is Peter's way of doing things, is he will jump the gun, he will jump and just say things or do things that he hasn't really thought through entirely. And so he says, "You are the Christ," without totally understanding what that meant. Jesus goes on to reveal his plan about what is going to take place. And if you remember, before Jesus is about to die, enter into Jerusalem, he's telling his disciples that he's going to die in this terrible way. And Peter says, "No, you don't have to die, though," which is true, isn't it? I mean, it's true. Jesus has the power to not go to the cross, like we just sang. I appreciate me and Steve didn't even coordinate this time, and he led a perfect song for it. He could have called 10,000 angels. Jesus had the power, just like we talked about, I believe it was last week, in Matthew chapter 16, when the Pharisees approached Jesus and they say, "Hey, show us a sign from heaven." Jesus had the power to open up the earth, call down a tornado, suck them up and throw them all over the place. He had the power to do that and to prove who's in charge and who's boss, and he doesn't do it. But Peter tells him, and I wonder if that was a temptation for Jesus because of the response that Jesus has to Peter. We know that Jesus was dreading the cross, but when Peter says, "You don't have to die, though. I mean, this isn't going to happen to you," Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." Well, then as you move along, it's like you can see those good intentions with Peter. He says, "You're the Christ," and then he has almost this compliment from Jesus, and then he says, "You don't have to die." He's trying to look out for this man that he's been following around and learning from. And then you get to the point where Jesus just tells him, "You're going to deny me 3 times." And Peter says, "No, I won't. If I have to die with you, then I'm going to die with you. But there's no way I'm going to deny you 3 times. And as you move along, we see that when they get to the garden, that arrest scene, who's the guy that pulls out the sword and chops off someone's ear? It's Peter. Now, all of this is leading to a head. This is all leading to a point here. Once you get into John chapter 21, look whose idea it is to go back to fishing. After all that. Now, I don't know about you, and thinking about if I had that life before, I could not go back to my fishing job. But if you look at in John chapter 21, it says, "After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciple by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way." Verse 2, "Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, son of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together." Verse 3, "Simon Peter said to them, 'I'm going fishing.'" After all of this, now how do you go back to fishing after walking on the water? After seeing demons cast out of people, after seeing these miracles take place and hearing these teachers and hearing of this place called heaven? Jesus talks a lot about heaven, talks a lot about hell too, but a lot of this is coming from Jesus. Peter gets all of this. We know he didn't fully understand all of it. Jesus dies, and Peter says, "Let's go back to fishing." Now, I think that this might come from more of a practical standpoint. Some people view this passage in that way. They say that, at the time you had followers of Jesus that were supporting his disciples. And so after the whole thing went down with the Romans trying to set the disciples up, saying that they came and they stole Jesus' body, that after all of this is happening, that Jesus is losing followers and they don't believe anymore. And so the disciples then are losing their way of life. And so they say, okay, well, we're not getting any money from them, or we might not be getting any money from them soon, so let's go back fishing. And you see the other disciples go along with him too. But there is almost this depressing feel to it. At least that's the way that I read it, and I don't believe I'm reading into it in that way. When Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing, period. You do see that sense of depression, or they're in this slump because Jesus has died and he was the hope, he was the Messiah, the one that could do all these miracles. And you think about it, you were in that inner circle with someone that powerful and that incredible, and then you see, let's go fishing. Now, I love fishing, but it does not compare to following Jesus around. They said to him, we will go with you. Then they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Verse 4, just as the day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet his disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? Now, that children, do you have any fish, should actually be translated lads or something like that. He wasn't calling them children. There's definitely a little bit of a language barrier here. But this was a very common greeting. And basically, this is what people would do on the shore to a fisherman if they needed something, if they needed fish. They would go out there, and it's almost like it's coming from an older man or someone that is older than those disciples, clearly, saying, lads, do you have any fish? I need some fish. There's none in the market, or for whatever reason. It was a common expression. It was a common request. It was nothing that would make them kind of perk up and go, is that Jesus? He just called us children. That's not what's happening there. But they answered him, no. And that's kind of our telltale sign. If it was Jesus, they probably would not even answer that question. But they answer flatly again, no. Verse 6 says, he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some. So I find it interesting. They cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved, which again, this has always fascinated me and also kind of cracked me up a little bit. The writer of this book, John, refers to himself in his own letter as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's just trying to clarify for his audience, whoever reads this. There's all the other disciples, there's Peter and all them, but I'm the disciple whom Jesus loved, referring to himself there. But that it was true. Jesus loved him. The disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, it is the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. There he is. He's back. That's the Peter that we know. And that's the Peter that has one of the proofs of inspiration is in every account that you have that is writing about Peter, they capture him perfectly. He is that person that is willing to jump in this case literally, into situations without fully understanding or maybe even thinking it through. Like, why didn't he just ride out with the rest of them? But he threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat dragging the net full of fish, which that situation in and of itself is a little bit humorous to me. The fact that he's the only one that jumps out, but then has to wait for the other disciples to get there in the boat slowly with all of this fish. Didn't think to help him with the fish or anything like that. But he knew that this was more important. But dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, but about 100 yards off. And when they got out on the land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out in it and bread. And Jesus said to them, bring some of the fish that you have caught. Really, Jesus caught, if you think about it. He's the one that told them where to cast the net. So Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. A few things I want to point out right here that I found interesting going through this. So first, Peter didn't think to help them bring the fish in, but then you see that he was a man of some great strength. You kind of get a glimpse of that when he chops off the ear in that garden arrest scene there. But you also see where you have the other disciples together hauling this load of fish in. But then here, Peter goes back and he hauls that big old thing of fish back by himself. I don't know if it was excitement. I don't know if he's just trying to do that, so Jesus can see. I'm not really sure what's going on here. But it does seem to show that he was a very strong man. 153 of them. Now, if you read about that number, if numbers catch your attention, if you're a mathematician or whatever, and you want to look into this, I would just suggest not to get buried in that number right there. I tried to figure out, what is it about 153, and it seems random. Why is it mentioned? But it's 153. It doesn't mean anything. It's not code for anything. 153 was just a tally. Now, it was very common for fishermen to write how many they caught. They would keep mark of their largest catches or their best catches. And so 153 is basically just a record to be checked on. So in order to add a proof So if you're telling a story, for instance, and you want to know whether it's a true story or not, and you're hopefully not being interrogated, but they ask, where were you on July 25th? You can either be like, oh, I was at the movies. But if you can tell them, I was at this movie, I was drinking this beverage, and this is the movie it was, and this is the actors that played in there, and this is the friend that I went with, and this is how many freckles this person has. If you can give details and things like that, it gives a little bit more credibility to your story, because people can go and check that up and count the freckles on your friend's face and things like that. So 153 was one of those weights that would hold, especially right after this time. When the church is beginning to gain traction, they can actually go back and check these records and talk to those that were actually around at this time. Okay, so 153 of them, and although there were so many, the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. I want to point out something very quickly here before we get into that section that you probably are very familiar with, when Peter is asked, do you love me 3 times by Jesus? And we're going to cover that pretty quickly, but I'm going to point out something about Jesus here. He is, at this point, the resurrected Lord. So the truth is out. The cat is out of the bag. He spent a lot of his time as this humble servant, and now he's the resurrected Lord. He is a completely changed person, at least as far as what he's going to be going through. He's no longer going to be put through any of the trials of the earth that he had to go through for his ministry. But see how, even as the resurrected Lord, as he is in that position, he's the one serving. He's the one that when they get to shore, the fire is already made. He's cooking for them. He's serving them and not the other way around. And we see these inhuman parts of Jesus, because if it was any one of us, probably, I'm just going to assume, any one of us that were placed in that position, they'd go, okay, well, you all are serving me now. You're my slaves now. I'm resurrected now. I'm not human anymore, entirely human. So that means you all have to serve me now. But Jesus doesn't react that way. We see that humility and that servant attitude that he has. But then there is this very intimate moment towards the end of this chapter that happens around the fire between Jesus and Peter. And this is where I want us to focus on and pull our application from. Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following him, the one who had been reclining at the table close to him. And he said, Lord, who is that is going to betray you? Oh, whoops, sorry, I went down a little bit too far. We are going to get to that part in just a second, though. Verse 15, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, I've heard this talked about before and applied in a few different ways, but I do want to go down and talk at least about those 2 different words that are being used here, but also look at it from a little bit of a different angle. Now, what's happening is Jesus is asking, we have one word for love, which is a little bit sad in our English language, but in the Greek you had several different versions, and so several different words that meant different kinds of love. Jesus asks Peter, do you agape me? Do you have a sacrificial love for me? And Peter responds with, I phileo you. I have this brotherly affection for you. Jesus asks him again, do you agape me? Do you have that sacrificial love for me? And Peter says, I phileo you. The last one changes up. Jesus asks him, do you phileo me? Do you really have an affection for me as a brother? So questioning even that love. And really this was for Peter's sake. Jesus already knew exactly what was going on in Peter's heart and in Peter's mind. But this was so that Peter could reflect on his own spirituality here. And so that's why we have that Peter is grieved in his heart. He says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Okay. There are three words that I want to pull out of here that if you want to write down on the side or maybe just take notes with this, why this section is so powerful for the Christian today in the 21st century. It teaches us about honesty. Sometimes when we are praying or when we're talking to God, even when we are talking to God and we're talking about maybe asking forgiveness for a sin that we have committed or sins that we're living with or that we're struggling with, instead of dare say what that sin is particularly, or excuse me, instead of actually saying what that sin is, we'll just say, please forgive us of our sins, and then move on. Almost like we're too embarrassed or can't say what we're actually dealing with or what we're actually struggling with. But notice Peter, as we've seen that he's the kind of guy that will say things without fully understanding. When Jesus asks him, Peter, do you agape me? Do you have a sacrificial love for me? Peter didn't even try to pretend or try and say, yes, I do have this agape love for you. I do have this sacrificial love for you. He didn't say that. He is completely honest at this point, and I believe it's because of maybe looking back over his life and seeing that, well, he just denied Jesus 3 times. And Peter didn't even believe that he was going to deny Jesus 3 times. And so now he's understanding Jesus can read hearts. Jesus can read minds. There is no point in saying, yes, Lord, you know that I agape you. I have this sacrificial love for you, because he had an understanding of something that sometimes we forget, that Jesus already knows. Jesus already knows the level of love and that we have for him. But again, look at the response that Jesus has to him. He doesn't say, well, you don't have the love. It has not reached the point that it needs to, therefore I'm going to have to cut you off as a disciple. You don't have any access to the kingdom of heaven anymore. He doesn't say any of that. In fact, he kind of pulls out the potential that Peter has. Even after Peter says, I have this brotherly love for you, I have this kind of affection for you, Jesus says, tend my sheep, tend my lambs. So work in the church, work with my people. And he says that all those times, even though he's not there yet. We learn about potential, because Jesus tells him, even after this, that he's going to die for his sake. And you can almost see the look on Peter's face as Jesus tells him that he's going to die. He's going to have his hands stretched out. He's going to be crucified. It's like Peter's thinking, like, no, well, hold up. I just said I didn't have the sacrificial love for you. I have phileo love for you. But Jesus is saying, at some point, you can and you will reach that point where you will be able to sacrifice for me. And tells him that right after this. The last thing that we see about this section that I want to pull out here is about the emotions of Peter. When he gets to that point where he realizes that Jesus now switches the phraseology there and says, do you really love me as a brother? And has to change it, because Peter is clearly not there where he has that sacrificial love. Peter's grieved because Jesus has to ask him 3 times. And the reason I wanted to make that point about his emotion is because Peter clearly cared about spiritual things. It wasn't this no big deal when Jesus says, okay, so you love me like a brother? Peter's like, yeah, I love you like a brother. He's grieved that he has to change his answer and that he's not where Jesus wants him to be. He cares. And so he is grieved about that. He cares about spiritual things. Now, applying this again to the 21st century, I'm sure you can make your own applications just from looking at the text there. But the ones that I pulled out from it was when we hear about people that have fallen away or left the church, or family members that have left the church, what is our response to it? Do we care, or are we kind of like, oh, bummer, I'm going to miss seeing him around? Or do we forget that the church is the ark? It's the ark that's on the way to heaven, that's going to eternity. And when they leave I'm not talking about going to another congregation, obviously, but like just leaving the Lord's church, they've fallen away. Do we care that they've jumped ship back out into the water? Do we care? When someone's baptized, are we happy, or are we joyful when this happens, or we're just kind of like, oh, another baptism picture on Facebook, woo. Or is it they got wet, congratulations, this is great. How do we respond to these things? And the biggest one that kept coming to my mind was when we sing. When we are joyful, when we have so much to be joyful about, so much to be grateful for as Christians, we don't have to be afraid to show those emotions when we are happy about things, or when we are sad, when we're asked in the foyer on the way out the door how we're doing. We can open up, and Peter shows that with his relationship with Jesus, and that he's laid everything bare. I hope that Peter has added some realism to Christianity for you today, a little bit more. Sometimes maybe we cook up these ideas of what Christianity is supposed to be like. Or if we fail time after time, maybe we start getting depressed like Peter did, and we get down into these slumps and go, I have tried, but I just can't do it, and I just can't get there. Peter shows us that you can mess up a whole lot, even to the point where Peter has denied Jesus 3 different times, and yet Jesus can look at Peter and say, you have so much potential, you can do so much better, and your love can evolve from just a phileo, I have this warm, fuzzy feeling towards Jesus, to I will sacrifice everything for you. And the same is true of us today. Your love can grow, and it all depends on what Jesus is saying right there. Tend my sheep. Well, Who are the sheep? Those are those in his church, those followers of his. And Peter does exactly that. If there is something that you are struggling with this morning, if you'd like to put on Christ in baptism and join that family, to get onto that ark, I hope that this has been a reminder of how joyful that Christianity can be, and how realistic Christianity can be, and the way that Jesus talked to Peter, how much Jesus actually loves us and what he expects of us and what he knows that we can accomplish for his sake if we're willing. If there's something that you're struggling with as a Christian, maybe you have fallen away, or maybe you are just struggling with something this morning and we can pray for you, we can help you. If there's anything that we can do, why not come together as we stand and as we sing?